nations would gather, share stories, share information, and essentially support each other. So that's a little brief history of Toronto. So I was invited here today to talk a little bit about Indigenous governance. I received a really great email from Frederic that basically was, putting some things together around what you all were interested in knowing about. I kind of giggled at it because when I saw it, I was like, so you guys want me to come and teach you a course? Because the amount of information there was very long, and it's great. That makes me very happy. It makes my spirit very happy, because this is the time of change where a lot of people were starting to have these conversations. But I will admit, this presentation, I would just keep in mind, I would serve it as an intro, just to one perspective of governance, and that would be the Haudenosaunee people. So we'll get into it. Oh, my password went off. Technology is supposed to make it easier. Okay, so I guess maybe I should start with a little bit of background on myself as well. I'm originally, like I said, from Six Nations of the Grand River. I moved here about 11 years ago now, to go to school. I went to OCAD-U, so I graduated with an undergrad in fine art, specifically drawing and painting, and then also a focus on Indigenous visual culture. So when I was going through school, there actually wasn't a designated space in my school. This is 2007, 2005, 2006, that area. So there wasn't really a designated area that Indigenous students could go to get support. So I was actually, as a youth, I became the president of the student group there and started advocating for that kind of space. And also, in the same sense, supporting the teachers. Supporting the professors, because I was finding that a lot of people, a lot of professors, although they meant very well, actually probably caused a little bit more damage than good, especially with me as an Indigenous student. I was looked upon a lot to be the expert, and for someone who's going to school, you're really wanting the support, and unfortunately, you're doing a lot of the teaching. But again, I will say I'm really happy because that's starting to change, and they have a designated space now. It's the Indigenous Visual Culture Program, and it's flourishing, and they're doing great things. So I started there, and then I also went into arts admin, and eventually, leading my way, I kind of, through community engagement and my volunteerism, ended up as the president of the Native Canadian Center. Now that's pretty new. It's only been about coming up on a year. So I've learned a lot in that arena, but I was always interested in governance and politics. And that is especially because Indigenous governance is very much, it's not a separate kind of entity in terms of, the way that we think about it and how it relates to the community, how it relates to the people. It's interconnected. Everything is interconnected. So, whether that be our healers, to our medicine people, to our teachers, to our faith keepers, to our governance and our government, it was all participatory, and it was all reliant on each other. So this kind of leads into my first point around why is Indigenous governance important and why is it different? So, although the models you'll see today are very similar, and sometimes depending on who you're talking to, some people actually claim that, and they feel that, some of the political systems are actually based on the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And that's what I'm going to get into a little bit in a bit. So why it's important, though, is because, especially now that we're moving into this idea of reconciliation, you can go back to the peace tree. Now that we're going to this area of reconciliation, a lot of people are starting to define what does that mean. And for Indigenous people and a lot of Indigenous nations, and specifically the Haudenosaunee people, it means getting back to our traditional ways of governance, but also traditional ways of how we sustained our communities. And that was always through going back to the teachings. So just to give you a little idea, I'm not going to go into specifics because we don't have the time, and I'm already running out of time. But essentially, before contact, our nations were separate. the Six Nations and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy you see today wasn't in existence. In fact, we were quarreling with each other. We were fighting over resources. We were fighting over these things. Not so much fighting, but just trying to keep our autonomy was the big thing between nations. We didn't want to be clumped together because we're all so diverse. But we did recognize that because of the way that the land was changing and the ways that it was actually pulling us closer together, we needed to start to have some kind of harmonious, unified way of thinking so that we could coexist. So, that was going on. What happened was there is a story, a traditional story that's told by the faith keepers of the Longhouse that essentially is talking about the peacemaker. So, this is way before this is pre-contact. When we were quarreling with each other, we had I guess the best way to put him would maybe be a prophet who essentially came and gave us the message of peace, which was the Kanakaroa, which is the great white roots on the tree of peace. So that's what you're seeing here. This is the symbol of that story. Now, I'm not going to get into the story because the story takes a week to recite. When you go to Longhouse, you're there, a traditional Longhouse, you're there for a week, every day from the morning to evening, doing ceremony, listening to the recital. They have one once a year, and it takes a long time because the fact is that the peacemaker actually went around to every single nation that was quarreling with each other. So he went to the Mohawk Nation, he went to the Seneca Nation, he went to the Onondaga Nation, he went to all of these nations that were part of the original Confederacy to spread words of peace. And when this was happening, a lot of people didn't believe him. They were going, oh, that's just a pipe dream. That's a fable. How is that ever going to work? And he had some guiding principles, and it's essentially a code that we live by. So I'm going to just get into those a little bit. Like I said, I'm not going to go into the story. It's a beautiful story if you ever do get a chance to listen to the recital. But it's just a little bit too long for here. But the principles are really is what is vital in understanding, and it's the guiding principle that underlies our governance. So essentially, it's a code, but it's also talking about unified spirit, but also unified mind. We recognize that in sense of Indigenous worldviews, we all recognize that, and this is across every nation. Every nation will talk about this, but essentially, it's that we are all spiritual beings here having a human experience. So that's that understanding of that, it's not an alternate reality, it's just an extra sense, the way that I describe it. It's an understanding and it's a kind of awareness. So that was kind of what he used as the commonality between each nation to say, hey, this is possible if we can start to really have, a clear goal in mind, but start to live by these codes, which essentially was, essentially ethics, really, when it comes down to it. It's just simple ethics. And it's all for the individual wellness, but ultimately for the collective wellness. So although you have autonomy and you make choices, everybody makes choices. You make a choice every time you get up if you're going to wear this or that. So it's not so much about, taking away the personal power. It's more about empowering that power and then putting it into the collective. So there's three main points that are in the peacemaker and the tree of peace. So essentially, it was if everybody acted with these things in mind, we could be unified and we could be more powerful. We would be more unified. So the first one is peace. So this isn't just the absence of war. It's also reflective of the way that we carry ourselves, having peace within ourselves. And that also reflects, that we're taking care of ourselves, we're taking care of our bodies, we're taking care of our minds, we're taking care of our spirits. And then and also that's reflected outward, so that it's reflected into the community, and then that way we actually support each other, working in unison. And the second would be power, so based on the responsibility and the development of the good mind in the individual. So that was really taking your own accountability and your own responsibility around yourself and developing that for yourself. You can never really tell, you can't put the responsibility of you wanting to be a good person on another person. Everything is within yourself. So that's one really big difference between kind of the way that we think now in society and the way that we used to think in terms of our traditional Haudenosaunee governance and the way we would practice, is essentially, there's this, we live in a society now that's very compartmentalized, separates, categorizes, and this philosophy, if I call it that, it's a philosophy, way of life, is based in the whole idea that nothing can exist without the other. So eventually everything will come in contact with something else, and if it's not of a good place, of the good mind, then it won't come to fruition, it won't be positive, and it won't be good for the community and the collective. So the next one is, and actually I think I'd like to read a quote from, I have a resource here from the Indigenous Education. It's a resource center that's just opened in Six Nations Polytech, but essentially this is written by Richard Hill. So for power, there is also a different kind of power in the Iroquois universe. Each individual has a base spiritual power. As you go through life as Haudenosaunee, experience different things, learn more, comprehend more, and tap into other forms of spiritual power, your own spirit grows well. The old timers call it orenda. Everyone is thought to have it to some degree. It affects how we do things. Good minds have strong orenda. So the ultimate power of the great law rests in how well the individual person develops their sense of self, but develops the sense in regard to the well-beings of others. So that's just a little piece to show how you're responsible for the self, but you're also responsible for what you put out into the community. So the next one would be righteousness. So essentially, righteousness, it's not about being right or wrong. It's more just about doing things guided by reason and with the good intention for the communal values. So again, reinforcing that communal, collective, interconnected methodology. So in terms of the principles of an Indigenous political thought, there's a few ones that we've carried forward into the future. And it has been based off of some of the things like the Peacemaker and the Great White Roots. But it's mainly, respect, harmony, peaceful coexistence, and the autonomy piece. I have a quote here from Takaki Alford from Peace, Power, and Righteousness, and it's called the Indigenous Manifesto. Really good resource if you really want to know a bit more about Indigenous governance and what kind of the issues we're facing today. So I'll just go into this quote. A crucial feature of the Indigenous concept of governance is its respect for individual autonomy. This respect precludes the notion of sovereignty, the idea that there can be a permanent transference of power or authority from the individual to the abstraction of the collective called government. The Indigenous tradition sees government as the collective power of the individual members of the nation. There is no separation between society and state. Leadership is exercised by persuading individuals to pool their self-power in the interest of the collective good. So that highlights one of the major challenges that we see now. This is how it translates to what we're going through right now. The communities, different communities across Canada are being asked to be a part of this process of reconciliation. But if we don't understand the core values of each individual nation, it's going to be very hard to try to unify them, or not even unify, but also have them coexist. And that is really, really laid in that autonomy piece. Because we don't have that separation, we don't necessarily say, like even me up here speaking, I'm speaking as an individual member of my nation. I don't speak on behalf of my nation. That would be the Confederacy, and we would be involved in that decision-making process. That's how we would have our voices heard. But I'm here to, build awareness of those types of activities so that we may get back to those. So, if you go to the White Roots of Peace, the tree at the beginning. So after the Peacemaker made his way around, and all of the nations agreed, a tree was planted as a symbol to remind us of how we were to act in this world through our nations. So this tree was actually planted with the Onondaga Nation. So the Onondaga Nation actually governs. They don't make the decisions, but they open and close the meeting and are essentially the mediators. So they are the ones that house this on their land. And essentially it's a white pine. And the whole idea was that because of the quarreling that was happening with our communities, if you look underneath, you'll see weapons. So the idea was that the communities came together, the nations came together in this agreement of this code of ethics and how they were going to operate going forward, put in their weapons underneath of the tree as a reminder to never pull those out, because they had this new code that would help them decipher and move through conflict resolution. And then also, if you look at the eagle on the top is essentially the connection to spirit and about how we are always to acknowledge that. And the eagle is seen as the gatekeeper between spirit and earth, and they are the ones that are always watching over us. So we always look to them to give us messages of any kind of danger, or if we need to revisit the tree at any time. So that's a very short explanation of the tree. So after this was the base, if you go to the next slide. So afterwards, this is where the longhouse was established. So the longhouse is essentially, it's housing. I mean, it's housing for families, but it's also housing for nations and for council meetings, traditionally. Today, we use them more for just reconnecting with these stories and reminding each other and supporting each other as a community. We don't necessarily live in them anymore. But essentially, this is where the democracy was housed for every single family. If you go forward a bit to the next slide. Yeah, so this is just an example of what the inside would look like. So essentially the way that our society, this society, the Haudenosaunee, is governed is by the women, actually. The women are the governors of their families, of their nations, of their clans. So although we have chiefs that are elected, the clan mothers and the women and the patriarchy, or the matriarchy, are what actually pick our chiefs. And for each chief, just to give you an idea, per longhouse you'd have one chief, and you would have a tree chief, which is essentially a training chief. It's basically it's succession planning. Something was to happen to him tomorrow, then we would have somebody that was second, and training. And then underneath them, they had the clan mother, that essentially was the governor of the clan of that house, but also would kind of keep the chief in line. And then we also had the male and female faith keeper. So all of those people, there's 5 people right after that chief to allow the chief to do his job for the community. And every time, and actually, you can look this up. There actually was a unchiefing. There's been unchiefing as well. Essentially, if you're not deemed to be acting in accordance with the code, you can be asked to step down and take a time out. But that's how we always ensured that everyone was getting a voice heard, and that the overall goal was always being followed. So you can go to the next slide. Yeah, again, it's just an example of what they looked like on the inside. Next slide. Okay, so this is a symbol. So one of the other differences between Indigenous in governance and knowledge and Western is we didn't write things down. We didn't write them down. However, we did keep track. And the way we kept track was through visual culture, through craft, through tradition. This is actually the League of Nations. It's essentially what it is it's like a wampum string craft. Like it's always just a signifier around how the roll call works, and it always reminds us of where everybody is within that. And an Onondaga string is always longer because they open and close. Next slide. This is actually the current Haudenosaunee Confederacy chiefs and clan mothers. So this is 2015. It hasn't changed much, but that's just to show you that we still follow these models. It's very much ingrained in our societies. Next slide. And then this is also, there was a signifier for our nations, as far as us being a visual culture nation, and the way that we actually communicated with each other and kept track. So this is just an example of some of the ways in which we, know when we see each other out there. Traditionally, that's how we would know where each other was from. was based off of the symbolism. Next slide. So this is the Confederacy belt. So this was created after we formed from the Tree of Peace, after the peacemaker had left. So essentially this is just, and it has an explanation at the bottom just to show you how it was broken up. Again, the Onondaga in the middle with the tree, because they were the ones that kind of led the Confederacy, the political network. And then also each of the squares representing the other 5 nations. Now we have 6 nations, but the Tuscarora people, they came after, and we also adopted the Wendat and the Delaware and the Tutula. So next slide. Oh, this. So this is really interesting because, you know, one of the things that we saw happen was a lot of people were really inspired by the way that we organized. And a lot of people wanted to, you know, essentially stamp that in history to show some of the unification. So if you see on the side here, there's the bundled arrows. So essentially, again, another image that is a representation around our political structure and our messages and our thought process and unity. You know, the arrows representing each nation that are part of the Confederacy, bundled together. When bundled together, they're stronger. They can't be broken as easily. Okay, next slide. Okay, so that's just a really brief background around how we govern ourselves as people. And now when we're moving into, you know, into the future, but also when we're starting to develop relations with other people that are not Indigenous. This is the Kaswenta, which is the Turo Wambam. Everybody seen that? You guys have seen that a lot lately? Yeah? So it's because of the reconciliation process, this is coming up a lot. But essentially what this is it's another documented piece of art, which is our language of how we record keep, that basically discusses the relationship dynamics between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, anybody else who is wanting to join in partnership with us. So this was actually developed pre-Confederacy. So essentially what this depicts is, it's the white essentially is the representation of the river of life, the river of purity. And then the purple is representing the canoe and the ship. And essentially each white line also reminds us of friendship, peace, respect. And essentially the whole idea is that, you know, we're traveling down this road, we're going to the same destination, we're going into the future. How do we relate to one another? The underlying principle of this, again, was always the autonomy. It was, you know, we can hop over, you know, for myself, I can hop over and I can, you know, get some information from the boat or from the ship, see how things are being done. But I was never intended to stay there. I was intended to gather information, share information, and support, but we were never to drive each other's canoe or ship. It was always a autonomous relationship, and we never got involved in each other's business. That was the original agreement. But we would assist each other when it was necessary so to reach the end goal. So that is the visual representation of that relationship. So you'll see that a lot when you hear conversations around reconciliation. Because essentially that's what we're asking for. It's more, that's embedded in it. It isn't so much about, you know, wanting to separate. It's more about equality, autonomy, and sovereignty. Being able to have a seat at the table, essentially. So, you know, moving forward into reconciliation. Will you do the next slide? Yeah, so that's just another, this is a design company from Akwesasne Reserve. So they've created these shirts. I didn't wear mine today. I was thinking about it, but I didn't. But essentially, this is a really great way. It's a visual to represent how we think of ourselves in terms of our community and our place in the world as Indigenous people. You know, you have the self, you have your clan, you have your community, you have your nation, without which you wouldn't be able to, you know your identity. You wouldn't be able to survive. But also it goes the other way as well. The nation has to care for the community has to care for the clans, and the clans care for the self. So it's it's a relationship based on reciprocity, and it goes, essentially it's circular. It's never ending, it's a continual relationship. So moving forward into, the future, challenges for decolonization towards reconciliation. I keep talking about this autonomy, but it's extremely important because it's a lot about, we're in this process as communities to try to get back to this knowledge. This is knowledge that we're still learning and relearning, because a lot of our faith keepers and a lot of our elders have passed on, or were products of, some of the traumatic things that happened throughout history. So we're in that revitalization process. So one of the major challenges that I'm seeing is that although it's amazing that we're even having these conversations and that we're getting asked to be at the table. But the one issue is that because we're kind of working at the same time to try to bring up and support our own communities, it's almost like we don't have enough people to go around to be engaged in that conversation because we're so busy trying to get everybody empowered again, essentially. Is to own that personal power and that self. So I know myself as a community worker, I spend a lot of my time with youth and, just really getting them to understand that their voice is important. It does matter. They have identity. We have these things to fall back on, getting them to understand these stories, but also preparing them for some of these conversations. I would never expect somebody who, is just coming out of the adoption system to be up here talking about these things. They have to be ready, and that's kind of what we're, at the community level, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get them ready to have these conversations, ready to start to take up that space, and ready to start to do what they need to do for their communities. So that's one of the issues is kind of seeing is, there needs to be a bit more education, but also a bit more understanding around where we're at within our own history. So that's one of the challenges that I'm seeing. And also too, it's just different ideas around, the worldview issue is always going to come up. I see it all of the time. It's just, it's a really nice notion. A lot of people have that notion around Indigenous people, they're so connected to the land, they're this, they're that. There's these ideas, right? There's these stereotypes, these stigmas. But essentially it's true. I'm not saying it's not. But those relationships are very ingrained and have a very strong history and a pattern behind it. And there's a lot of there's difference in understanding. And that's where the worldviews comes into place. So if I was offering any advice to teachers, to educators, is to really get a handle on the difference between worldview, and then also, where we're at in terms of our history. But again, it's another thing that we're seeing a lot of is that, I recognize, because I get a lot of these, I have a lot of these conversations lately more than anything, and I recognize that it's a very sensitive, and it's a very kind of, sometimes it can be an awkward position to be put in, to be asked to, speak to some of these things, and not have any kind of context, because we're still working on our relationships at the end of the day. We're still trying to redevelop and reestablish positive working relationships that are coexisting. So I think that, going forward, one of the things that we all need to do in this process is to just recognize that. If we can recognize that and we can start to just be really honest, and at the end of the day, even having some of those codes, some of the ideas of the code of the peace tree, at the end of those, supporting those relationships, it's going to create a really great space, but also it's going to get us to kind of remember where we came from, because everybody's a part of that. I'm saying Indigenous people, Haudenosaunee Nation specific, but one of the things I think is really important to note about this and about the peacemaker and the Tree of Peace is that we adopted people. People would come to us that were not Indigenous, that were settlers, for example, before Confederation, that wanted to be a part of what we were doing. They recognized that, we went years without having any war. We went years with taking care of the land, having really bountiful harvests, really understanding the land it was we were standing on. So a lot of people came to us and wanted to be a part of that. I'm not saying that's bad. I think it's really great, and that's essentially, for me, that's what Canada was founded on, was that relationship, the coexisting, but also just that autonomy and respecting each other. And so I just wanted to add this here, is just to give you a better understanding around, what is interconnectedness? You hear that a lot. What is interconnectedness? And essentially, this is a painting I did. It's called Mizwe-Beek. Mizwe-Beek is a Ojibwe phrase, which essentially, it's a teaching in itself, but it also reflects some of the code as well. But essentially, it's taking some responsibility and taking some ownership around what you put out into the world. So Mizwe-Beek is the understanding that, whatever you put out, whether it's positive, whether it's negative, whether it's hope, whether it's anger, it's going to have a ripple effect, and it's going to touch, and it's going to interact with other people's ripples. So this whole painting is talking about, having the good mind, walking with those codes in mind, so that when you put those things out there, all it's going to do is reflect that back to you and create beauty. And essentially hoping that you get to go back to Sky World, whether that be, for you, it could be heaven. For me, it's more, on to the next journey. What are you going to learn next? So I hope that answered a little bit of your questions. I'll have some time for questions, but that's essentially just a little glimpse of what I wanted to share with you today around the codes and what we can do going forward. So thanks. So do we have any questions? I'm sure there's lots of questions. Yep.
I'm just curious, when you think about... if you could just repeat that.
Sorry. Mike.
Did you have... Oh, sorry, couldn't hear. I'm just curious as to your opinion on this. So when you're thinking about Indigenous youth, whether they're on or off reserve, what's most important, or how do you approach teaching them, and maybe this is more relevant for off reserve, how do you approach teaching those youth civic engagement? Like what dimension do you work in?
It's tricky, because like for myself, I'm a really passionate person, though, also for politics. I really like politics and being involved in, voting and things like that. I think it's important because, if we don't do it, then we don't have our voices heard and we're not part of the conversation. And that's just the way it is. That's the way society is set up. But I think really what it comes down to is trying to, if you could link it to something in their nation that has is rooted in the same type of governance or some kind of structure, that's what's really going to get them. Because they're going to get light bulbs going, whoa, this existed before, and like, how do I adapt that to now? Because some of these things are very relevant. They're very relevant. I use it every day. Like when I have a board meeting, for example, when I have to be the mediator, I'm always calling on the peacemaker to help me make some of those decisions and have to say some of those tough things. So that would be one of my advices. From my experience, when they actually can make some connection to their culture and to their history, that's where you can really start to get them engaged, and you can see the fire, right? You get to see the fire and you get to see the light. And ultimately, that's what we want for everybody. Yeah. Thank you. Got a couple of here.
Can you just repeat the name of the concept?
The concept?
That was reflected in the painting that you showed us?
Oh, Mizwe-Beek.
And how do you spell that?
M-I-Z, Mizwe, M-I-Z-I-W-E, B-I-I-K, two words.
Thank you.
Yep. Actually, we have in Toronto, there's an organization called Mizwe-Beek Employment and Training. So they focus on Indigenous employment and economic development. So that's just you can kind of see that. You probably Google it and you would find it. Yep.
Right here.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was just wondering if you would be able to provide a bibliography or suggested resources where we might be able to take this further that could be provided to CIVIX and then distributed to us as participants so we can get everything In other words, we'll have a bit more time to digest and to further our education. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So I actually have a list. So if you want, I have left cards with Frederic. So if you want to talk to me or chat with me, I'm completely open about that. You know, I just want to support people. So I have a list of people that, you know, I've called on in terms of resources for this presentation particularly. I will say though, you know, a lot of my knowledge doesn't really come from books, it more comes from the community. So it comes from sitting with community, sitting with elders, sitting with knowledge keepers. And I would say that just in terms of for your classroom, is that, you know, the more you can get the community people to come in and do these things, because that's their jobs. You know, our faith keepers in our communities, that's their jobs, that's what they do. So you're going to stimulate the economy of our nations, but you're also going to get it firsthand from people who have lived experience and also have had these knowledges and these lessons, these teachings passed on generation after generation after generation. So that's as good as it's going to get, I feel, because that's our classroom. Our classroom isn't sitting reading books, it's getting out there, going to ceremony, sitting with elders. So the more interactive, that's a very interactive way to do it, and I do recognize that it takes resources, and that's something I hear all of the time, is that the resources are very lack. And also just in terms of definitions around what you can and cannot do. But you know, what I say is always just do and then beg for forgiveness after. That's my motto, yeah.
Hi, I just have a question about, I know you're an artist.
Yep.
I tend to incorporate art into a lot of other subjects, which I'm sure we all do, math, science, etc. But you made me think about politics and civics. How do you, I don't know if all of your art is political, most art is, but is there a way, this is just an open question, I guess it's hard to answer, but bringing art and politics together and governance in terms of indigenous governance and our own democratic governance and how we can tie them together in an art form.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's actually a lot of what our cultures did. We did that naturally. Again, like I said, because we never documented things the way we document them now. We have documented them now in that way because it's an ongoing demand that we need to do that. But if you know, there's a lot of different things. There's the wampum belts, which is what you were seeing there, which is specifically the political documentation around relationships and agreements. I would go as far as to say they were preceding treaties. So they were essentially, you know, they coexisted along with treaties, which was essentially what we brought to the table. And then you also look in terms of history, like history keeping. A lot of our nations had star blankets, or they had, you know, they had documentations of the wars that had gone on that basically sat with the chiefs. They were done on hide. So I would even encourage you to take a look at some of the places, like for example, I know the AGO has a few collections, the National Gallery, Smithsonian is really good for that. They have a lot of our those original pieces. But I do a lot of that work too as a community worker. Is really getting youth to look at some of those things, and if you were to make something today that's going to express your situation and kind of, you know, our political arena, our society, what would that look like? It's amazing the amount of things that come out of that. Art's really engaging, especially for Indigenous peoples. Again, it's not separate, right? It's all connected. You know, even myself, like I'm an artist, but I'm also a leader. Like I'm also a part of the leadership. But I'm also a helper when it comes to community and ceremony. So it's like we never had one role. We had many roles, and they all overlapped with each other. So. Good to go here first? Okay.
Hi. So in grade 4, one of the topics is early societies, which is a really big topic for 9-year-olds. And I want to start with First Nations, the people that were here first in Toronto and on the island. And my fear is that I'm going to misrepresent. We have a teacher who comes in from First Nations school, and she often says, oh, we don't use that word, we use this word. We don't use myths, we use stories. And there's so many ways we can misrepresent. So I just fear, or wonder if you have any advice about, we want to incorporate Indigenous peoples into our teaching, but I'm worried about getting it wrong
Right.
in important ways
Yeah.
with language and so on.
So my theory on those things, like it's a very warranted feeling, because again, it's that we're reestablishing relationships, right? So we want to get it right this time and get it back on track. So we don't want to do things like that that's going to maybe cause more harm, right? But what I always tell people is just ask. You know, there's lots of people out there to ask, and in terms of, you know, how if I'll say anything, the one thing that I've found with other members of the community and myself, I'm not a particular fan of the categorization of the lumping everybody together, because, and you probably notice it if you go and take a look at, I'm half Ojibwe. I could have done a presentation just on Ojibwe ceremony and Ojibwe ways of doing it in the Three Fires Confederacy, which is a whole other thing. Although the communities were really close. So I would just say that, you know, at every opportunity you can take, just ask, you know, ask us. And we're more than happy, most people are more than happy to sit down. I guess, again, it goes back to that issue that we're seeing right now, is that there's very little of us to go around, though, right now. We're very, very busy, which is great. But I think in terms of, you know, one of the things that I see that should be implemented everywhere is this idea of consultants, you know, people that are there as liaison workers that can, you know, support you and answer some of these questions. And if they can't answer it, they'll find it, right? Because there's also protocols, there's all these things involved in acquiring knowledge in our communities. But I would say definitely that is something that maybe you would be interested in advocating for, as somebody who you could bring in that's essentially, you know, that's their job, is to support the teachers. Right. I think that's a great idea. I mean, we have it here in Ontario, as far as I know. One of my best friends is the Minister of Indigenous Education at the ministry. So she does a lot of the hiring for the liaison workers that are in the board, at the board level. But that's the board level, right? So I find that it's lacking in terms of the more frontline getting in there and really working with the people that are working with the students. Because it's always that top down, how does it travel? How does the information travel? So that would be one thing I said, you know, in terms of, for everybody, you know, if there's something that you need and you're not getting what you need and you need support, just keep asking for it. Because the more people you get to ask for it, the more you're gonna, you know, be able to justify the ask.
Yeah, thank
right?
you.
Yeah. Hope that answered some of your questions.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was great. This is maybe a more general political or government question. As we move through this, you know, pretty challenging process of reconciliation, how do you see Indigenous governance sort of coming into play in our political system that we have now? Is there a role? Is that a thing that should be incorporated into the way that we sort of practice politics and government, or what?
Yeah, so it's tricky, right? Because I'll just give you an example of how tricky it can be. Is within my own community with Six Nations of New Credit, we have the traditional confederacy, which is based off of the White Roots of Peace. The model is still all the same, like I showed you, the circle with all the chiefs' names that was updated in 2015. They still do that. They still meet as a grand council from every single nation. And some of our nations are actually in the US. We don't have borders. So that's another issue that gets kind of tricky as well. But for our community, we have them. We have the confederacy, the traditional confederacy. But we also have a band council that was put in by INAC. So essentially is the direct funnel to the federal government. That, unfortunately, for my community, has caused a great deal of contention. It's actually, I feel, caused more damage than it has anything. And it's really divided the community. And that's the last thing we want to do. Now, for me, this is just my opinion personally, I see the benefit of engaging in political conversations because of the voice, you know, voicing the concerns and really getting clear information, because, and also in particular, holding people accountable for the duty to consult. That's a huge one for our communities, because how do you make decisions if you don't actually know what's going on in the communities that you're working for? So that's one big thing. But also at the same time, I agree with the Confederacy as well. You know, like I'm very much on the fence and in the middle of that, because I believe in what they do as well, because they're restoring culture. They're doing it from a very historical-based practice, you know, that never really died. It was always there. It's just in the terms of right now, it's being revitalized. So I think in terms of, you know, how we engage with the broader conversation, you know, if I had my dream, we would have a political party. That would be my dream. And it would be comprised of every single person, one person, a representative of the nation, which is essentially the great roots of peace, right? It's that same model. But again, you have to consult. You have to consult with everybody. There has to be more intention in the conversation. Right now, we're a checkbox. You know, that's the problem. You know, a lot of us were, you know, oh, we went and I talked to this one Indigenous person, so they speak for everybody. It's like, that's not really how it works. So it's coming back to that collective voice, but still maintaining the autonomy. So I hope that it kind of answered it, but not really, because there's work to be done, right? Yeah. Yep. The two-row?
Advo voice. There's a great. I've been trying to work with treaties, local treaties, as a way of just making a local connection to where the land is. And there's a great article about a project in the last Advo Voice with Maria Hupfield, who's an Anishinaabe
I know Maria.
artist.
Yeah.
I thought you might. Looking at treaties, and it's a beautiful art project that they did. I was going to ask though about sort of related to this question, the Assembly of First Nations. I was trying to link that in my own sort of teaching about Canadian government, and I'm not fully clear on where they fit in terms of national governance of Aboriginal people.
Right. So from my understanding is that they're there to do the consult. They're there as the consulting body. They're elected. They're elected by the nations. Similar system. But again, like ours is a little, like Six Nations is really complicated because it's very big, and we've had this political structure for a long time. So it's difficult to try to find some unison in how we work into that. But yeah, essentially they're there to, you know, bring up certain issues. Like, for example, they were really fundamental in mobilizing the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry. And they were very prominent in the I Don't Know More conversations. So when there's a very broad national issue that comes up, I find that they're more focused on taking care of that as opposed to at the community level. I mean, they do filter back to the community and they answer to the community, but they're really at that high level of having some of those conversations. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. Just like to first start off by saying I feel connected to you in some way. I grew up in Caledonia, Ontario.
Oh, okay.
Very close to Six Nations Reserve, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can give me some perspective on, in this era of reconciliation that we are working toward and establishing better connections and relationships, how close do you think we are? I mean, how soon do you think we can get there?
Yeah,
it's a hard one.
Yeah, it's tricky. Because, I mean, it all depends on who you're talking to, right?
Yeah.
I would have a different opinion than somebody who's up north that still has a boil water advisory,
Yeah.
right? They're very much further removed from some of these conversations. Like, they're not even thinking about these conversations because they have other things to think about.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of just the understanding of where we need to go, what we can do, I think that's definitely happening a lot faster. But again, it's the, you know, I think like I find a lot of the onus falls on non-Indigenous people to try to pick up the slack, but I don't really believe that. I mean, I think that the process is collaborative. Like we have to do our own fixing at the same time. But the fundamental right now, what we really need to be focusing on is recognizing the truth. and the truth first. Because if we can't get to an agreement on what it was, we're never going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
Or we
Theory
really won't.
always easier than application, I guess.
Yeah, and that's why this is why I mean, I get asked to do a lot of these conversations and, you know, breakaways, roundtables, things like that. But I was really passionate about this one because you guys are educators, you know? This is your job, is to tell the truth, you know, as much as you can. But I think it's also just talking about, you know, really trying, unfortunately we're still digging for it. We still have to dig for it. Because I'll be honest, you know, in terms of the things that, because I've had many of these conversations, a lot of people tell me they never heard of any of these things. Wow. You know, some people I meet have never heard of residential schools. You know, it's still something that's happening, where the information is finally getting disseminated, but it's what do we do with it? That's the part, right? But we all need to get to the same place where we recognize that, yes, it happened, so what are we going to do about it? Right? And we need to educate about that. So,
Thanks.
thank you. Got a question here? Oh, right here.
Yep, no problem. Hello, I'm originally from Vancouver, and I was a big fan of West Coast Indigenous art. So this is a question about sort of art and politics. So you have the idea of like the two-row wampum.
Yep.
Are these kind of symbols stretching across Canada? Like, do you have these conversations, art and concepts and politics sort of melding together? And what do other Indigenous people on the West Coast or the East Coast? You're from central Canada.
Yeah.
Does this give you power that others on the edges might not have?
Yeah. So I find that I'm finding the two-row, specifically the Kaswenta, is very much resonating with a lot of people across the nation. Just because it's really allowing each community to take responsibility for itself. You know, for so long, we were basically, you know, we had the responsibility for taking care of us was put in the hands of somebody else, which that essentially talks about that we shouldn't have been doing that in the first place. So I think that idea resonates with a lot of different nations across the country. And even in the U.S. as well. You mean you saw it at the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. Like the Kaswenta was very prominent there in terms of symbolism. So I think it definitely, depending on the conversation and where we're at in history, it will probably overlap in certain places. But I mean, yeah, I think it's just naturally going to happen because we're a melting pot, right? We're all, and especially like social media is a huge part of that, because now I can talk to somebody that's in Salish country, you know, or in territory. I can talk to somebody who's Cree in Manitoba. I can talk to, you know what I mean? Like I can have FaceTime with somebody that's there. So that's a huge part of it as well. So I think you're going to see that definitely a lot more moving forward. I mean, I've been told this, and I didn't do it purposely, but even in my artwork, I've been told that I have a lot of West Coast style in that, in terms of like some of the symbolism. And that just happens coincidentally. But ultimately, you know, from my belief, and again, this is just me, I think we're all Indigenous. We're all Indigenous. We're all made of the same fiber. We're all made of the same cells. We're all made of stars, and we're all made of earth. So does it not then mean that we're responsible for all of the information? Are we not all responsible for it? Hope that helped a little bit. A couple more? I don't know how we're doing on time. Okay, one more question.
Oh, thank you. My students this year did a project on energy poverty and trying to address energy poverty. And one place they looked at was Pekanjikam. And so they did a ton of research, and they found out that like there's plans with the Ontario government to get hooked up to the energy grid, and they thought this was great. And then they called the reservation in Pekanjikam, and they spoke with them, and they said they had a lot of concerns about how the Ontario government was doing it, and that they hadn't been consulted. So, which was fascinating to me, because when we did the research and we found out they were being hooked up to the energy grid, my ignorance, I was like, I think this is a good thing, and I was really happy. Then we decided to call them and find out what they thought about it. So I know we're talking about reconciliation, and one of my closest friends is Ojibwe, and she's spoken about how she thinks as history teachers and politics teachers, we're doing a better job of teaching about like residential schools, 1960s baby scoop, et cetera, but less about the history you shared today, which is like how they contributed to Canadian society, the positive contributions, art, inventions, architecture, et cetera. So as we move towards reconciliation, do you think that, like, how do we support the idea of getting a voice, right? Like that, or is that voice happening? Do you think the government is actually engaging in consultation? I know that's a big question. Just
We have
because
government officials here. Am I being biased?
because it was really shocking to, and they were amazing. The people who
Yeah.
we spoke to in Pikangikum, they were amazing, and they literally spoke to my students on 3 different occasions for like an hour. They were so helpful, but it was an eye opener for myself as well. And like, it wasn't that they were like, no, we don't want energy. That wasn't obviously the answer. It was how it was being done and the lack of consultation process, and that they weren't necessarily acknowledging certain things that already existed there.
Yeah, so
sorry, I know
that
that's a
process, so outside of all the other things I do, I work for Princess Charities Canada on their Indigenous employment initiatives. And one of the things we're constantly advocating for, at least I'm advocating for, is that duty to consult, but can it go past that, right? Because in that situation, it makes me think about, okay, but who's getting the economic gain from it? You know, ultimately, like, you're going to get billed, and it's going to go to a conglomerate. Where does that conglomerate filter back to the community? Where's the self-sustaining mechanism in there? And one of the very, very simple ways that people can do is contribute to the training and the education and hire Indigenous people that are on that territory to do the installation. To me, it seems really simple, but when you actually get to have these conversations, people are like, "Oh, well, it's too much to invest in terms of getting these people, providing money for them to be at training and specialized training." And I'm going, "Is it?" Because in terms of economic development, I mean, we're the fastest growing population. Our youth is the fastest growing population of Canada. I think that's probably pretty bad for your bottom line if you're not investing in them. That's just me. But in terms of that question, I think we need to be more thoughtful around how we consult. Because consultation means something different to everybody, right? Consultation to us is consulting in a sense like the way that I was talking about, of having a voice, the autonomy, but also having the voice of the individual contributing to the collective. I see it a lot, like I said earlier, is a lot of people do the checkbox, right? Like they come in and they have a community forum, and how is that distributed? You know, a lot of our community also is very old. Do they have Facebook? Probably not. So there needs to be a bit more of that on-the-ground community engagement piece, but I think ultimately what it comes down to is fear. You know, people are afraid to do that. It's different. We've never done it before. So it's just trying to think of different ways that we can be a bit more proactive in including that voice, because if you really want to include it, you'll include it. But if you don't, you won't. And it sends a very clear message to us as Indigenous people and communities. We're definitely looking at that. So is that community likely to, collaborate with you in the future? Probably not. So it's all coming down to those ethics. It all comes down to the values. What do you value? If we can kind of get united in that and explore that a bit more, we'll definitely be in a better place, relationship-wise. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Great.
Sorry, we're going to have to conclude.
Yeah, no problem. So I just wanted to say again, like I mentioned earlier, I have cards available, so if you wanted to get any of the resources that I used here, a couple of them just to really quick is the Jake Thomas Learning Center, the Iroquois Resource Center, the Woodland Cultural Center, which is in Brantford, Ontario, Kanata Village, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy site has a lot of really great resources, and they do a lot of, they go out into classrooms, they have people that go out from the community that go and talk about these things. And then in terms of the city, just going to do a real quick pitch for the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto. We actually have a new program, which is our Cultural Competency Program, which is run by Michael Etherington. He does a fantastic job to just do, treaty history, pre-Confederate history, all the way up to contact, and then our current political engagements, and really gets into some of that nitty-gritty information. And he's a great presenter. So I would definitely recommend that for you all.
We will share all these resources with you following the bootcamp.
And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. Thank you. So I just want to thank Lindsey for this very insightful introduction to Indigenous governance, and I encourage all of you to speak amongst them yourselves during the break that we're having right now. So we're going to have a 15-minute break. There's coffee available. The washroom is just here at the back of the room. If you have any questions for Lindsey,